إلا الله محمد رسول الله.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا ونبينا ومولانا محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. سبحانك لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما. آمين برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته. أهلا وسهلا ومرحبا بكم. I welcome you back to our course, our level 2 al-Ulum al-Hadith course on Imam Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani's Nukhbat al-Fikar, towards understanding the core concepts in Hadith theory. Bi-idhnillahi ta'ala, we commence where we left off with our course outcomes, understanding Hadith and its role in Islam, mastering standard Hadith terminology, and understanding Hadith preservation, transmission, as well as authentication. For this particular lesson, inshallah ta'ala, we will zoom in on Hadith classification as far as acceptability and rejection is concerned. Having dealt with acceptability, we now focus in on rejection. Then specifically we look at the reasons for rejection of a hadith, and finally, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala, the types of breaks in the chain. The types of breaks in the chain, which will of course become clearer as we proceed bi'idhnillah. What have we done to date? We have looked at several topics and discussed them in our previous lessons. What is a hadith? Giving a brief introduction thereto. When, why, and how were a hadith transmitted, documented, and preserved? Yani the hadith origin story, writing as a means of preservation, and then the various stages of writing all the way from informal to formal writing of hadith. Then the different genres of hadith literature, from the musannaf literature, having given a brief introduction thereto, then the musnad literature, the sahih and sunan movements, and the methods and history of hadith criticism, how to verify important news. Those were some of the background topics that we dealt with, alhamdulillah. We then looked at the emergence of fabrication and the methods of counteracting it, which led us, of course, to classic hadith terminology, because a science was born from that defense mechanism, and that science has terminology that we need to understand in order to make sense of the science, in order to fully benefit from the science bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. And for that, we focus in on the branch of knowledge called mustalahul hadith, a subgenre of ulumul hadith, and we focus specifically on Imam Ibn Hajar's Nukhbatul Fikar. We have, alhamdulillah, conducted several lessons in relation to the Nukhba, and some of the topics that we have covered is the division of the number of chains and how the particular narration reached us, how many chains of transmission there are. We looked at the concept of mutawatir and ahad and the various sub-branches of ahad, including gharib, aziz, mashhur or mustafid. And then we looked at, in terms of the just in terms of the order that we have it here, we looked at supportive evidence. So we learned about the mutabi' and the shahid, and i'tibar being the concept of comparison. And in terms of acceptance and rejection of hadith, we have been focusing predominantly on maqbool, the accepted narrations, having looked specifically at sahih li dhatihi, hasan li dhatihi, sahih li ghayrihi, hasan li ghayrihi. Now, all of these terms should ring a bell. In fact, you should know them thoroughly by now if you are following the lessons, because they would be essential to understanding the subsequent lessons bi'idhnillah. Then moving on to how does one act on certain ahadith when there are contradictions or other evidence, and when there's no contradictions. So when do you act on hadith? Ma'mulun bihi, you act on them when they are muhkam, free of any contradictions, mukhtaliful hadith, where you had to produce some sort of synthesis to make sense of seemingly contradictory hadith, or the abrogator in the case where certain ahadith are abrogated. What is not acted upon is, of course, the mansukh category or the abrogated category of hadith. So we've looked at all of this in detail. Then we said the next discussion is hadith that is mardud or rejected. Having looked at the accepted categories, and you can see there we've covered essentially everything that there is to cover in terms of what is accepted. But the science of mustalahul hadith was actually not the primary objective is not just to sort of rubber stamp everything as being authentic and acceptable. But what was more important to the scholars was to discern what is unacceptable, what is rejected, and why, and how do we detect those reasons for rejection. So that brings us to the discussion on mardud or rejected ahadith. Under this particular category, we have touched on two concepts, and that is shadh and mu'al. When I say touched on this, it means that we've just explored the fact that these discrepancies could cause a hadith that seemingly is authentic to actually turn out to be very weak. So shadh is a concept that we've covered to an extent, as well as ilal. But of course, there's further details to be elaborated upon over there. As for where we find ourselves now, reasons for rejection could be one of two, essentially. Saqatu fi sanadi and at-ta'nu fi rawi. It could either be because of a drop, an omission in the chain of transmission, or because of a discrepancy in the narrator or one or more transmitters of the hadith itself. So as far as a discrepancy in the sanad, that type of drop or missing link could either be zahir, apparent, or khafi, hidden, and this is what we'll be focusing on in this lesson bi'idhnillahi ta'ala, this little square or rectangle over here. And then of course what we still have to cover as far as the essential terminologies are concerned is the rest of these over here, as well as these basic concepts over here. So alhamdulillah, that leads us to the course text in front of us from the Nukhbat al-Fikar. And we continue from where we left off. So we'll now discuss the mardud category or the rejected category of hadith. So to elaborate on that, let's look at the text inshaAllah ta'ala. Imam Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani قال المصنف رحمه الله تعالى ونفعنا الله بعلومه وعلومكم آمين. He says, ثم المردود. Then the rejected category. إما أن يكون لسقط. It's either because of a drop in the chain, a missing link in the chain, أو طعن, or because of some element of criticism with the narrator or transmitter. فسقط, as for missing links or drops in the chain, he then says, إما أن يكون, it's either going to be من مبادئ السند, from the beginning of the chain, من مصنف, with the author, starting from the author himself, أو من آخره, or it's going to be at the end of the chain, meaning closer to the actual hadith transmission of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, بعد التابعي, or it can be after the tabi'i, after the successor, أو غير ذلك, or another possibility. He then explains, فالأول, the first of what was mentioned, is called al-mu'allaq. Now at this point, it's not expected that you immediately follow. This type of text is of course very condensed, so he says quite a lot in a short, condensed form, a concise or comprehensive form. Our objective initially is to translate the words literally with a little bit of technical understanding, and then to elaborate on the details of the concept itself as we proceed. So for now, we're just doing the literal translation with some technical contextualization in between, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. So we continue. He says, وَالثَّانِي, the second type of drop or omission in the sanad is called al-mursal, involving the tabi'i, which we'll elaborate on a little later. وَالثَّالِثُ, the third type is إِنْ كَانَ بِإِثْنَيْنِ فَصَاعِدًا, if it is a drop of two or more transmitters consecutively, مع التوالي, consecutively, فهو المعضل, that is referred to as a mu'dal hadith. وإلا, but if it is not consecutive, فالمنقطع, then it is going to be referred to as severed or cut hadith. ثم قد يكون واضحا أو خفيا. These discrepancies or missing links in the chain could either be واضحا, clear, أو خفيا, or they could be hidden and difficult to detect. فالأول, the first type, which is clear and apparent, يدرك بعدم التلاقي. that can be perceived by understanding that the transmitters have not actually met one another. ومن ثم, and thus احتيج إلى التاريخ, to understand that they have not in fact met one another, you would have to resort to dates. You would have to resort to the birth dates and the death dates of the scholars in order to determine, was it possible for them to have met or was it impossible for them to have met. And of course, as I mentioned previously, all of the information pertaining to the transmitters are compiled, right? They are encyclopedic works dedicated to the biographies of transmitters of hadith, where our traditional scholars had exerted themselves to compile as much of the details of each transmitter's life as possible. Of course, the more well-known transmitters, their lives are documented to a very extensive degree, and on top of their own personal lives, also what others had opined about them based on their transmissions. So that's also documented. So points of criticism, whether in favor of them or whether against them, has also been documented in the books known as Kutubur Rijal. So that information will serve us as far as detecting whether a hadith is reliable or not. Essentially, if we can find that two transmitters, one being the student, the other one being the teacher, lived in the same time, so their birth and death dates correspond, making it possible for them to have met, then we assume that they had in fact met. What would be even better than that is if we have evidence of an established meeting between the two of them where available. And of course, that's a more stringent condition that theoretically was asserted upon by Imam al-Bukhari, rahimahullah ta'ala, which is one of the reasons that his Sahih takes precedence over any other form of authentic compilation. So what Ibn Hajar is saying here is that we need the history, we need the dates to specify whether these flaws or missing links in the chain exist or not. So moving on from there, he says, وَالثَّانِي, the hidden type of drop is going to be in the form of al-mudallas, a hadith that is sometimes translated as obfuscated, وَيَرِدُ بِصِيغَةٍ تَحْتَمِلُ اللُّقِي. And a mudallas hadith is presented with a formula that carries the possibility that there was a meeting, that they actually did meet. كَعَنْ وَقَالَ, so the transmitter would use the expressions an, literally translated as from, وَقَالَ, or he says, he said. So both these terms, an and qala, you see there's some ambiguity in them. We'll unpack that as we proceed, inshallah ta'ala. And then finally, the last segment that we'll unpack in this lesson is وَكَذَا الْمُرْسَلُ الْخَفِيُّ. Very similar to the concept of the mudallas hadith, al-mursalul khafi is min mu'asirin, by a contemporary, lam yalqa, that was not actually met. So that's our focus text for this lesson, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. Let's put things into context to see exactly where we were and how we find ourselves at this point in time. So the primary category of mustalah here is bihasbil qabuli wa rad. We are looking at hadith from the perspective of what is acceptable and what is rejected. As for the acceptable types of ahadith, we have in the previous lesson categorized them as al-muhkam, which essentially consists of the categories of sahih, sahih li dhatihi, sahih li ghayrihi, hasan li dhatihi, hasan li ghayrihi. Even though some would add this as a separate category and not necessarily under muhkam, but they are one and the same. Then we looked at when there are contradictions, if you have to resort to jama', in other words, synthesizing between various transmissions, then this is referred to as mukhtaliful hadith, which we looked at in the previous lesson. If you have dates and you can prove that one came later and one came earlier, then that refers to naskh or abrogation, in which case you have the nasikh and the mansukh. And if you cannot do jam' or naskh, then the next step in the scholar's rhetoric would be at-tarjih, which is to give preponderance to one transmission over others because of some sort of qarina, some sort of external evidence. And if that too is not possible, Then finally, the scholar resorts to tawaqquf, where they suspend their judgment and their practice on a particular hadith until further evidence is provided. So that was the accepted types of hadith, and we dealt with the details so far. Moving on to the other side, mardud, rejected ahadith. As we said before, rejection could be because of one of two reasons. Either it is at-ta'nu fi rawi, a discrepancy in the transmitter, or as-saqtu fi sanadi, a drop in the chain. As for at-ta'nu fi rawi, we'll deal with this in a future lesson bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. And as for as-saqtu fi sanadi, a drop in the chain, that's where we find ourselves in this lesson bi'idhnillah. So now we're going to analyze exactly when and where these drops occur. I'll speak about them theoretically first and also demonstrate them practically in the form of a diagram. What is important to understand is, what are we doing, right? Where do we find ourselves in terms of the pedagogy of understanding this science or these sciences of ulum al-hadith? Whenever we are studying something intricately, then there will be various perspectives that we analyze that particular object or subject with. So say, for example, if we're talking about water, if we're studying water, we may discuss various perspectives about the water. For example, you may speak about the water's clarity. You may speak about the water's viscosity. You may speak about the water's salinity. You may speak about the water's chemical composition, additives. I'm just making this up as I go along. You may speak about the water from the perspective of whether it is a solid, liquid or gas. You may speak about the water in terms of its temperature. But all of these discussions still revolve around water. Why then would you need to become familiar with the terms like salinity, viscosity, density, all of these different perspectives when essentially you're still just speaking about water? Well, clearly, in that example, a person who wants to be proficient and truly understand water needs to understand it from these various perspectives, because inevitably, in their studies, in their analysis, they will come across these terms being utilized by others who had studied water previously. Thus, being able to navigate their research, being able to navigate what they've stated, and then eventually reaching a point where one can also analyze and understand and contribute to the research. So we find ourselves at that point where we are also trying to make sense of water. Our understanding, of course, is based on hadith. So we are trying to understand hadith. But there are various ways, there are various perspectives about hadith that we need to understand. And we're moving through those perspectives. From the very onset of this course, we've looked at hadith from the perspective of its compilation. We've looked at it from the perspective of its authority as being a vehicle of the sunnah. We've looked at it in terms of historical developments and phenomenon around it. Now we are looking at it from the perspective of mustalahul hadith, right? Jargon or technical terms or nomenclature about hadith. Why do we need to study the nomenclature? Just like I've used in the water example, the various discussions around hadith are going to utilize these terms. When a scholar refers to a hadith, for example, he's going to say, this is a hadith Qudsi. For you to properly understand what is being, what is being referred to, you would need to know what a hadith Qudsi is. You would need to know that a hadith Qudsi doesn't have any impact on whether the hadith is authentic or not. You would need to know that when a scholar says a hadith is mutawatir, then the terms of sahih and hasan and da'if don't apply to that hadith. You would need to know that when a scholar speaks about a mutabi' or a shahid, that what he's speaking about is supportive evidence, and you would know exactly what type of supportive evidence he is mentioning. So this is why we study mustalahul hadith. It's to become versed in the sciences of hadith by first understanding the terminology that was developed by the scholars. Now, if somebody understands the concept of salinity and viscosity and density and chemical composition and the state of whether it is a solid, liquid or gas in terms of water, does that mean that the person who knows those terms is automatically a scientist, is automatically a professional or an expert about water? Of course not, right? It just means that this person is better suited, better equipped to interpret other researchers' work about water, to read works about water and to be able to understand what is being discussed. That's what we find ourselves doing currently. By studying Mustalahul Hadith, you do not become a muhaddith. By studying Mustalahul Hadith, you learn the tools to understand the language of the muhaddithun. As for the practical implementation of these tools and seeing them in action, this is an entirely different journey. And it's necessary to take that journey in order to become more proficient in hadith. But every journey has different stages and it has steps. So the initial steps is to cover these preliminaries before we get into the more technical stuff. That's why this is a second year or a second level Ulum al-Hadith course. What you need to also understand is that these terms are essential. If you do not understand them, then there's no question about further application or practical application down the road. You would always be dependent upon these terms to grasp the concept of hadith. So I would argue that somebody should ideally understand the theory and have practical application simultaneously. So to get the maximum benefit from a course such as this, by now, it would be essential for the student to start reading hadith and to start reading the works of the muhaddithun or the comments of the muhaddithun on those hadith. And here we are not speaking about reading hadith from a book like Riyadh al-Salihin or the Arba'in of Imam Nawawi. Not that there's anything wrong with those works, but those are secondary sources. They are not sources that deal with the isnads of the hadith. They do not deal with the asanid of the hadith. And therefore, they are very limited. You are only going to deal with the mutun, the text, the theory behind the text, the religious concepts, the spiritual concepts, etc., which are excellent. And it's essentially part of the study of tazkiyah. But to get a grasp of the working knowledge of hadith science, you have to read hadith in its proper form from its primary sources. So perhaps a study of the Shama'il al-Muhammadiyah with a teacher who deals with both the isnad as well as the matan of the ahadith, or reading one of the books of the Sihah Sitta like Imam al-Tirmidhi's Jami' or Imam al-Bukhari's Sahih, Imam Muslim's Sahih, or one of the other of the 6 books, or perhaps a different book entirely, but a primary reference of hadith. That would be the ideal approach. But if you don't have, they say in Arabic, ma la yudraku kulluhu, la yutraku julluhu. What you cannot attain entirely, do not abandon it completely. So for this reason, I'm mentioning all of this at the beginning of this dars, just to say that if you cannot be in the ideal situation where simultaneously you're studying Mustalahul Hadith and applying it or seeing it in action, then for the very least, master the science of Mustalahul Hadith by memorizing all of the terms, committing them to memory as you would your sarf scales, fa'ala, fa'ala, fa'alu and the like, for those who had learned in that particular method, or like you had learned the rules of nahu. Because just like with nahu and sarf, when you enter the world of hadith, you need these terms, you need this theory to make sense of what the muhaddithun have stated. So the moment they say that something is, or they give a particular categorization, like they say that such and such a narrator is a mudallis, you don't have to go and look up what is a mudallis, what is tadlis. You already have a theoretical knowledge thereof, but then you can see the tadlis in practice. Now, what is tadlis? In this lesson, we will cover that inshaAllah ta'ala. So let's now focus on the theory in front of us. We are looking specifically at weakness or rejection based on links in the chain, links in the isnad. When a chain is completely connected, meaning there are no missing links, then this chain would be referred to as muttasil. Right? Muttasil means the chain is connected. Another word used for this is musnad. A hadith that has a complete isnad is referred to as a musnad hadith. This is different from the categorization of hadith literature. Remember, we dealt with the musnad literature. Essentially, the musnad literature is called such because it has complete chains of transmission all the way up to the Prophet ﷺ, which before that in the Musannaf literature wasn't really an emphatic point. But herein we are speaking about a hadith being musnad, means it has a complete chain linking it up to Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. So that is the musnad. Now, as for broken chains, when a chain is broken as opposed to being connected, you refer to the chain as munqati'. The word munqati' comes from the Arabic word qata'a, which means to cut or to sever. When a chain is munqati', cut or severed, it means that there is no complete connected chain that reaches to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Rather, there are missing links. But in this lesson, we want to ask, okay, saying that something has missing links is general. We want to be able to specify exactly where the missing link is or what type of missing link that is, because it will have an impact on the level of problem that you are dealing with in the chain. Any missing link is a problem, right? Because the definition of a sahih hadith, one part of it was mattasala sanaduhu, that which has a connected chain, a muttasil sanad. So the moment there's no connected chain, we already know that you cannot possibly be dealing with a sahih hadith. But now, how much has it dropped? Does it drop down to the level of Hasan? Does it drop down to the level of Da'if? Well, technically, if there's a missing link, if there's genuinely a missing link, then for the very least it's going to be weak. That's a form of weakness. Of course, we want to now know how weak, right? What exactly is missing from the chain. So there are various ways of describing it. If there is a subsequent or consecutive missing link, 2 consecutive missing links, then we know that's called something. When the missing link occurs at the level of the tabi'i, then that's called something else, right? So these are the terms that we are looking at in this lesson, and now we will look at that inshallah. So as Ibn Hajar mentioned, that when a hadith is mursal, it is when a tabi'i, meaning a successor, narrates directly from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam by saying, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, right? So of course a tabi'i, a successor, did not meet Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wasallam. If he met the Prophet alayhi salatu wasallam, he would be a companion. So it's impossible for a tabi'i to directly transmit from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But what happens when a tabi'i does this? So the tabi'i, let's say for example, Hasan al-Basri, radiyallahu ta'ala anhu, he says, قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم, or he says عن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم, or he says it has reached me from the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم. We know that by necessity that Hasan al-Basri must have heard this hadith from someone. He could not have heard it from the Prophet عليه الصلاة والسلام. But the problem is we don't know who he heard it from. So this is a tabi'i transmitting directly from the Prophet alayhi salatu wassalam. We refer to that type of hadith as mursal. Now before you ask questions about, so what does that mean? Does that mean that the tabi'i actually received it from a sahabi or that he received it from somebody else? That's not what we are discussing right now. Is such a hadith authoritative, such that it holds weight in Islamic law, or is it not authoritative? That's not what we are discussing right now. Right now, we just want to become familiar with what is a mursal hadith so that we can build on that knowledge. Later down the line, inshallah, we will look at the implications of a mursal hadith as well. And there are some details in relation to this, but I believe the best way of learning such a technical science is to do so gradually in stages. First build a foundation and then build on top of that, and Allah knows best. So the first category we learned about in terms of a severed chain or a munqati' chain is the mursal category, which is when a tabi'i transmits directly from the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wasallam. Then the next type is mu'dalun. Mu'dalun. A mu'dal hadith is a hadith whose reporter omits 2 or more consecutive reporters in the isnad. So instead of just having one missing link, we actually have two missing links, and two or more actually, and these two or more missing links are consecutive. Now, this obviously means that it can happen anywhere in the chain, but there are specific categories for at the beginning of the chain and at the end of the chain. So basically, mu'adal is when in the middle of the chain you have two or more consecutive missing links. So we don't know who this teacher is nor this teacher's teacher, right? And that creates a problem in the chain of inqita', or the fact that the chain is severed, but in a way that is a bit more impactful than just having one missing link, for example. Moving on from there, the next type of missing links or missing link phenomenon is called mu'allaq. Mu'allaq, literally from the word alaqa or alaqa, to be a clot or something that's hanging or something that is suspended. So for example, Suratul Alaq, Iqra' bismi rabbika alladhi khalaq, khalaqa al-insana min alaq. The same root letters form the word mu'allaq. So a mu'allaq hadith is suspended, it's hanging, right? How is it hanging? The definition will clarify. A mu'allaq hadith is a hadith whose reporter at the beginning of the chain omits one or more consecutive narrators. Now, whenever we speak about the beginning of the chain, we are referring to the author. So, for example, the person who compiles the book, right? So, if you're speaking about the Jami' of Imam Tirmidhi, then Muhammad ibn Isa ibn Sawrat ibn Musa ibn al-Dhahak al-Sulami Abu Isa al-Tirmidhi, he would be the author. Imam al-Tirmidhi would be the author. So if there's a missing link, not just one, but there is a missing link of one or more consecutive narrators from Imam Tirmidhi all the way up, and he just goes straight to the Sahabi, for example, or he omits the whole chain and quotes the Prophet ﷺ directly. Now, mu'allaq is actually a phenomenon that we come across most of the time with hadith when you're not a scholar. For the general public, when scholars quote a hadith, whether that be in their classes or in their Jumu'ah khutab or in their lectures, etc., generally speaking, a scholar contemporaneously would simply just say, the Prophet ﷺ said, or he would state that عن أبي هريرة رضي الله تعالى عنه قال قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم, and then say the hadith. So he would mention the Sahabi. Another form of mu'allaq that we come across regularly is in literature, in secondary sources. So in the Riyadh al-Salihin of Imam Nawawi, in the Arba'een of Imam Nawawi, many other books as well, you would find that the entire chain is omitted. So Imam Nawawi doesn't mention his sanad all the way up to the Sahabi and then mention the hadith. He just tells you, عن ابن عباس رضي الله تعالى عنه قال قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. So that form of presenting the hadith is referred to as mu'allaq, right? Mu'allaq. And there's of course some theory around the mu'allaq hadith. There's some theory, specific to certain books like the ta'liqat, the mu'allaqat of Imam al-Bukhari. But those discussions we'll have once we have a firm grasp on the basic structure, inshallah ta'ala. So a mu'allaq hadith is generally going to be where from the author, he omits his teachers to a certain extent, either going up to the tabi'i or going up to the sahabi or going up to the Prophet ﷺ, and then just mentioning what's remaining of the hadith. So the hadith is suspended or hanging there because there's no chain that's connecting it. Okay? That doesn't necessarily mean that there is no chain. It just means that in the form in front of you, you don't have those links to check. For somebody to verify a mu'allaq hadith, they would first need to find the chain of that hadith. So if you want to look at the authenticity of a hadith in Riyadh al-Salihin, you would have to find the reference of that hadith within the primary sources. And once you have that, then you have the full chain, and then you can assess the reliability of the hadith. Moving on, we go to general munqati', right? Munqati', again from the same word, munqati'. When you speak specifically about a munqati' hadith, the classical view is that this is referring to any break in the chain. So wherever there's a break in the chain, you can refer to it as a munqati' hadith. It's almost like saying the munqati' hadith means a broken chain, but then if you add a word, it is mursal. So mursal hadith is munqati'. A mu'dal hadith is munqati'. A mu'allaq hadith is technically munqati'. So it's a description essentially of what type of inqita', what type of cutting. Herein, however, there's a definition given as a later view, a more contemporaneous view than the classical view, is that any break in the chain that is after the sahabi, in other words, it can't be that the sahabi is the missing link because that would be mursal. It can't be that it's consecutive missing links because that would be mu'dal. And it can't be at the beginning of the sanad till wherever because that's going to be mu'allaq. So that is a more sort of the later view on inqita' or what a munqati' hadith represents. Now that's a lot of theory, relatively speaking. You've got a few concepts there that are potentially new. Now the best way to understand a technical science with this type of theory, even though the theory is somewhat distilled here and very minimal, the best way is to actually look at it in the form of a diagram and then teach it as such. So if nothing has sunk in just yet, and it's just a bunch of words, then inshallah ta'ala, this next slide would clarify things a bit better. So looking at it from this side of the slide, okay, the first thing I want to point out is when we speak about the beginning of a chain and when we speak about the ending of a chain. So the beginning is the author. A, in this case, means author. And the green circles at the top, or the green ovals at the top, has an S in it that refers to the Sahabi. And of course, the blue would be representative of the words of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. When you have a missing link between the tabi'i and the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, right? So the tabi'i is directly quoting the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. By definition, the tabi'i did not meet the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. So we don't know what's happening here. Is this a sahabi? In which case, there's no issue. But we don't know that it's a sahabi. And therefore, this type of inqita', meaning the missing link here by the big black X, this is referred to as mursal. And if you've understood that, then that's great. That's all that you need to know about the mursal category at the moment. Are there more details? Absolutely. Does it become a lot more technical? Yes, it does to an extent. But for now, understand that when you see the term mursal, by default it refers to a hadith in which the tabi'i or the successor transmits directly from the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. طيب, the next category is the mu'allaq category. What is mu'allaq? So you have the author, right? And the author doesn't mention his teacher or his teacher's teacher or his teacher's teacher's teacher. He mentions the Sahabi's name, right? Abdullah ibn Abbas, for example, he said that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said. So because you don't have this entire sanad, right, this is referred to as a mu'allaq hadith because it's just hanging there. So that is mu'allaq, the suspended form. Now remember, this doesn't necessarily mean that there is no chain or that it's absolutely made up. No, it's just that the chain you are looking at. So if you open up Riyadul Salihin, you don't see any chains of transmission there. You just see the Sahabi's name. So is there no chain between Imam Nawawi and the Sahabi? Absolutely, there are chains. Right? For every hadith, there would be a chain. But because of the purpose of Riyadul Salihin as a kitab, his objective was not to compile a primary reference of hadith. He wanted to compile a book that would act as a spiritual guide from the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, categorized in a certain way, arranged with certain topics. So he didn't set out to actually compile the chains of transmission as well. Now we move on to the next type of inqita', or the next type of missing links. If you have the author and you have the Sahabi and you have the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, but in between there are two or more consecutive missing links. So here you have the missing link at the level of the tabi'i and the follower of the tabi'i. So such consecutive missing links are referred to as mu'dal, right? We've explained all of this. This is just a diagrammatical representation. And finally, inqita'. So we said munqati'. The word munqati' basically means severed. And classically, a severance or a missing link anywhere in the sanad is called inqita'. But more specifically, the latter muhaddithun or mustalah scholars, they had specifically categorized that munqati' is when you have one or more missing links, but they are not consecutive, as you can see here, nor is it missing at the level of the sahabi, which would make it a mursal hadith, nor is it from the author all the way up to the sahabi, which would make it mu'allaq. Instead, you have one or more missing links randomly spread out through the chain, but not at those positions. That is munqati'. Now, beyond that, after this explanation, there's really nothing more to add at the basic level, with the objective that you need to memorize the definitions and understand the definitions before we add meat to what we've just stated here. For every concept that we mentioned, the mursal, the mu'allaq, the mu'adal, there are more details. But shay'an fa shay'an, inshallah ta'ala, gradual progress in the science is the best way to study this and other technical sciences as well, and Allah knows best. Now, Ibn Hajar had also mentioned to us that this type of missing link, right, this type of inqita', the reason for rejection is inqita' or missing link. It could either be wadih, so very apparent. How would it be apparent? It's apparent because the birth and death dates of these scholars, of the student and the teacher, they don't overlap, right? So you can see that, look, the one scholar, he passed away, mathalan, in the year 204. Okay, so Imam Shafi'i, for example, passed away in the year 204. So if Imam Shafi'i passes away in 204, then somebody who is born in the year 206 cannot possibly have met Imam Shafi'i rahimahullah ta'ala. So by checking up those details in the history books, or specifically the books of narrator criticism or kutubur rijal, we would then be able to detect that this person could not have transmitted directly from Imam Shafi'i. There's a missing link in the chain. So that's wadih, that's clear. You can pick it up by simply checking dates, right? Another way of checking this is also that the locations don't overlap. Like if somebody never left Iraq, mathalan, but he's quoting from Imam Malik rahimahullah ta'ala, who never left Medina except for Hajj, and he doesn't claim to have met Imam Malik on Hajj. So how is he transmitting from Imam Malik if he's never left Iraq and Imam Malik never left Medina? So that's another way that you can clearly see that there's a missing link. But what happens when the missing link is khafi, hidden, right? If it is hidden, then that means that there is a possibility of meeting. In other words, if you look at the death dates, the birth dates and the death dates, then there's a possibility that scholar A met scholar B because they lived in an overlapping period of time. So when there's a possibility of meeting, you're not easily going to be able to detect that there's a missing link here. Now, generally, when this happens, we move on to a new concept of missing links that is hidden. This is why we call it obfuscation. It's obfuscated, it's made unclear. And there's different ways of categorizing this. So when there's definitely a meeting that had taken place, or there is transmission that has taken place between said student and teacher, right? But then the student transmits from the teacher something that he didn't actually hear. Okay, so a contemporary example, which I'll show you here in this next slide, inshallah, is so here you have myself, right? I don't belong on the muhaddithun's list. These are contemporary scholars. I heard the transmissions from Shaykh Muhammad Awwama, hafidhahullah ta'ala, one of the great muhaddithun of our time. But my transmissions from Shaykh Muhammad Awama is very limited. I heard the hadith al-Musalsal bil-Awwaliyah, the hadith that is generally the first hadith to be transmitted, and he gave a general Ijaza with that. But I didn't hear, beyond that, I didn't hear hadith directly from him. I also met a student of Shaykh Muhammad Awama, Shaykh Mujir al-Khatib in Istanbul, and I have heard some things from Shaykh Mujir al-Khatib as well. Now, I can present to you the words of Shaykh Muhammad Awama and state simply that he said, right? He said. Or I can say from Shaykh Muhammad Awama. Would it be true? Yes. Did I directly hear from him? Yes, I did. But the thing that I'm telling you, in other words, the hadith that I'm saying, for example, if I tell you Shaykh Muhammad Awama transmitted إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ, actions are judged by their intentions. Did I hear that directly from Shaykh Muhammad Awama? The answer is no, I did not. So I did hear from Shaykh Muhammad Awama, right? There is an established transmission there. But now I'm transmitting something that I did not hear from him. In fact, I perhaps got it from his student, Shaykh Mujir al-Khatib, who got it from Shaykh Muhammad Awama. So now the isnad would look like Irshaad from Shaykh Mujir al-Khatib, from Shaykh Muhammad Awama, from Shaykh Abdul Fattah Abu Ghudda, but I don't mention Shaykh Mujir al-Khatib. Why don't I mention him? Because look, I have transmitted from Shaykh Muhammad Awama, so I might as well just go straight to Shaykh Muhammad Awama. So this creates a problem, because there is definitely a meeting that had taken place, right? We know that the meeting had taken place, but now I'm transmitting something that I didn't actually hear from him at all. That there for the muhaddithun is a problem. Why is it a problem? Because you need an established connection for every single hadith to be connected, right? You cannot just say, well, there is a connection, so I'm just going to transmit everything else from the teacher as well. Remember, I used the contemporary example, and I'm going to use some more. But the asani that we are analyzing, these predominantly occurred and formed in an age where, things are not as they are today, where you can watch recordings and listen to lectures and purchase books written by these scholars that have been published and printed. This is a legacy that was predominantly before formal writing had really set its course as we've studied before. It was an oral transmission, and therefore you cannot rely on just the fact that somebody met somebody else that gives them the right to transmit everything from them. No, they needed to have heard every single transmission from that person if they transmit from that person. So this concept is known as tadlis, right? Tadlis. The person who does this is called a mudallis. So here on the image on the side, you have a chain of transmission. Here you have the hadith from the Prophet ﷺ, the Sahabi, and you have your chain. Now, the author of this book, he transmits from his teacher, number one, right? Now, number one has met scholar B, or transmitter B over here. He has met him and he has transmitted from him. However, he didn't transmit everything. He then meets a contemporary, a classmate. Let's call him a classmate. And the classmate informs him that scholar B has transmitted to me, and now I'm transmitting to you. So scholar 1 simply just omits number 2, and he quotes directly from B. Now, we wouldn't be able to detect this just by looking at dates, because they definitely met. They definitely had transmission taking place between them. How am I to know that this specific narration that he's transmitting here, he did not hear from that scholar? When he says, I've heard it from him, and he's a trustworthy person, he's got adala and dabt, then there's no issue, right? There's no issue, because I've already established that he's trustworthy. I've already established that he's precise. So when he says that I've heard it from scholar B in our example over here, then we would take his word for it that he heard from scholar B. Because if he didn't, and he said that he did, that would make him a liar, and thus his transmissions would be rejected entirely. But what if he doesn't say that? What if he doesn't say sami'tu, right? Or akhbarana, or haddathana. Instead, he uses some elusive language, like he says an from scholar B, or he says qala, that scholar B said, transmitter B said. Now, because the scholars are so precise about established connections, if they determine that this narrator, number one, is guilty of this practice, if they determine that he was found guilty of transmitting from his teachers things that he didn't actually hear from those teachers, then they would categorize him as a mudallis, as an obfuscator. Don't use the English terms that I offer. It's just as a as a sort of an offering, so that you have an English word, but use the Arabic terminology bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. When somebody is a known mudallis, this means that he was found to be guilty of transmitting from his own teachers things that he didn't hear from them. He heard it indirectly. Such a scholar, there's a bit of a red flag, because you're going to find in his literature, or rather in his biography, that he's a mudallis. So what does that mean for you and I, trying to authenticate, or trying to establish the reliability of a hadith? It means that if we see that the mudallis transmits with the sigha, or the formula, saying an or qala, or anything else that is sort of elusive, that carries the possibility of having actually met, or rather having actually heard it, or it also carries the possibility of an indirect transmission, then because he's a mudallis, this would render that particular transmission as problematic, and you would have to regard it as a munqati', or a broken chain. Why would it be broken? Because technically, I know I'm making the diagram a bit all over the place at the moment, but technically, if he transmitted from somebody else, in this case, transmitted to over here, then that means he's omitting this transmitter. So it should read our author A transmits from transmitter 1, who transmits from transmitter 2, who transmits from transmitter B. But because he made tadlis, he just has the author from transmitter 1, from transmitter B, and he says an, or he says qala, which is technically correct, and you won't be able to detect it because he had in fact met this particular scholar. So this is tadlis, right? It's a hidden form of omission that is considered by the muhaddithun as something very, it's a criminal act essentially. Like you don't omit scholars. Now there are different types of tadlis as well, right? We've looked at the most basic form, but there are other forms as well. There is the form where the same phenomenon happens, but further up in the chain, right? Where a transmitter doesn't omit the person that he transmitted from, but he does this further up in the chain. We'll explain that shortly. Then there's the phenomenon of a transmitter hiding the name of his teacher. Let's say his teacher was known to be a weak or unreliable transmitter, and he knows this. So to disguise the name of the teacher means that he could potentially fool the listener. Fool is probably a harsh word. He could potentially mislead the listener into believing that this is some other transmitter. So he uses a kunya, for example. He says Abu so-and-so, as opposed to the name that he's known by. This is also considered a type of tadlis, although obviously not the same. So this is an introduction to tadlis. But there's something that's very similar to tadlis, right? It's not considered tadlis, but it's similar. And that is on the chain here, or rather on the slide here, it's called al-mursalul khafi. So what's the difference between the two? We said it's similar, but it's not the same. Tadlis, which is what we just did now, is when you have an established meeting between the transmitter and his teacher, but then he goes on and he transmits something that he didn't hear from his teacher. But what happens when you have somebody transmitting from a contemporary that he never ever met or he never transmitted from? So there's adamul laqi. There's no meeting. There's no established meeting or there's no established transmission. So again, I'm going to give you a contemporary example just to, for the sake of understanding. And that would be this one over here. So here you have this faqir, this weak one here. I never met. Bil asaf shadid, may Allah allow us to meet all the scholars that we can and benefit from them. But I've never met Mufti Taqi Uthmani, hafidhahullah ta'ala wa ra'ah. I've never met him, but he's a contemporary, right? I have never met Mufti Taqi Uthmani, yet in the history books, if you look up, Allah knows best, who's going to make it to the history books and who's not. But if you were to look up a basic brief biography of mine 100 years from now, if it still exists for some reason, then you would see that I lived in the same time as Mufti Taqi Uthmani, hafidhahullah ta'ala wa ra'ah. And if you were doing, isnad criticism, then technically you wouldn't know that I didn't meet unless I expressed or wrote or something, or this recording that says I never met. So just using the dates wouldn't be sufficient to detect that there's no possibility of meeting or that I didn't actually transmit. The dates is not going to be enough. So again, that's hidden. You're going to need some extra information to provide you with clarity that there's no transmission here, right? There's a missing link here. So when I transmit something from Mufti Taqi Uthmani, I may have transmitted from somebody who I did meet who has a transmission from Mufti Taqi Uthmani. For example, Shaykh Haytham al-Haddad, hafidhahullah ta'ala, I met him recently. So he has a link to Mufti Taqi Uthmani. So if I transmit from Shaykh Haytham over here, but I don't mention that I received it from Shaykh Haytham, I just quote an Mufti Taqi Uthmani, right? Then again, you wouldn't be able to detect this because we lived in the same time period, yet there's no established transmission. So now I'm not guilty of tadlis, right? Because I never met him. If I had met him, this would have been tadlis. What I'm guilty of now is actually irsal khafi, right? Mursalul khafi is when this phenomenon takes place, where the transmitter, myself in this question, transmits from a teacher that he did not actually transmit anything from. He's not a student of that teacher. That is not his teacher. They are contemporaries, so there was a possibility of them meeting. They may even have met, but there was no transmission. So if I transmit from such a teacher, that would make me guilty of irsal khafi. Mursalul khafi is essentially this, right? So again, there's a fine difference. In the case of tadlis, I transmit from a teacher that I have met, like Sheikh Muhammad Awama, but I transmit something that I did not hear from him, as if I heard it from him. That's tadlis. But in the case of irsal khafi, I transmit something from a teacher who I never transmitted from at all. There is no established transmission between us, and I transmit from him as though I actually met him and I actually received the transmission from him. Because we are contemporaries, it's going to be difficult to detect. But when it is detected, then this is called irsal khafi. And again, there's a missing link. Because in the case of my example, I should have mentioned, I heard from Shaykh Haytham al-Haddad, who heard from Mufti Taqi Uthmani, hafidhahullahu huma wa ra'ahuma. That is essentially the difference between tadlis and irsal khafi. Now, I've provided you with some notes here as well so that you can sort of reaffirm these concepts. So tadlis, the type of tadlis that is sort of the standard form of tadlis is known as tadlisul isnad. What we've just explained of tadlis, that is known as tadlisul isnad, and the explanation that you see here is exactly that, right? So read over it, inshallah. I've already explained it, but this would be just to sort of solidify the concept for you. Then the next phenomenon that I used was irsal khafi, and the difference between the two, which is exactly what is described over here. So again, explanatory notes just for your benefit, inshaAllah ta'ala. Then I mentioned that there are other forms of tadlis, right? Tadlisu taswiya is the one, and tadlisu shuyukh is the other. So let's do the easiest one first. Tadlisu shuyukh, as we said, is when a transmitter hides the name of his teacher for whatever reason, usually because the teacher is either a problematic transmitter or he's weak or something of the sort. So he hides the name of his teacher so that he doesn't his transmission doesn't appear problematic. That there is easier to detect and less problematic than the other form of tadlis. Why? Because technically there's no missing link. There's just a disguise of one of the links. And because there's no missing link, it doesn't render the hadith problematic automatically. Still, it's something frowned upon by the muhaddithun. Tadlisu taswiya is just a different type of the tadlis that we mentioned previously. So he says, this is in reality a type of tadlisul isnad. It is a narrator narrating a hadith from his sheikh with his isnad and then dropping the name of a weak narrator occurring in between two reliable narrators who are known to have met each other. So he hears a hadith from his sheikh who is reliable. That's A. So let's just document this. So you have the author, and then you have a reliable transmitter, and then you have he hears a hadith from his sheikh who is reliable. A. Who narrates it from a weak narrator. B. Okay. Who hears it from a reliable transmitter. C. So the weak link here is B. So if you have a phenomenon where this transmitter A omits B from his transmission and simply mentions C. So now the isnad would read, this would be our author. So the author says, Haddathana RT, Haddathana A, and he would say, Qala C, which means that he's omitting this narrator entirely. This is called tadlisu taswiya, right? This is called tadlisu at-taswiya. It's just a different form of tadlis, but also problematic because again you have a missing link in the sanad, and that is the major issue in relation to that. All you have to do here is make sure you understand the concept and memorize the definition or the phenomenon in practice. This will really sink in when you start analyzing chains of transmission and you come across a transmitter and you look up his biography, and Ibn Hajar or Imam al-Dhahabi tells you that he's a mudallis, right? He's a good narrator, but he's a mudallis. And then the transmission in front of you, you see that this mudallis, he says an or he says qala. Now you know exactly what's happening. You know that this is a problem because he's a mudallis. He said this, now his transmission has to take a different light, unfortunately. Now remember that the mudallis could be a good person. He's just guilty of this one hadith crime, let's call it that. So what happens if a mudallis transmits from a teacher? He, of course, has transmitted from this teacher before, but now he uses an or he uses qala, and unfortunately he uses it in a context where he did in fact hear that hadith from that teacher. You see, we don't know that. All we have is the fact that he's guilty of tadlis at some point or the other, so he's been red flagged for that. And we know that in the instance in front of us, he uses a sigha, a form of ambiguity. So he says qala or an. Whether he actually heard that transmission from his teacher or not, we wouldn't know, because all we have is the evidence in front of us. And based on the evidence in front of us, the fact that he's guilty of tadlis and he uses that particular sigha an or qala, that means that by default, the standard ruling is we would have to consider this as a munqati' transmission, that there's tadlis here and therefore there's a missing link in the chain in all probability. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. So that brings us to the end of this lesson about missing links in the sanad and the reasons for it. Looking quickly at the next lesson, inshaAllah ta'ala, we will deal with at-ta'nu fi rawi, where there's a discrepancy in the transmitter or transmitters being either liars or accused of lying or having made gross mistakes, etc. We will look at that bi'idhnillahi ta'ala, which means, of course, we are now going on to this side of the mardud or rejected transmissions. Alhamdulillah, so we are moving through our map. Make sure you are comfortable with what we've covered so far and that you are fully aware of what comes next and why we are doing this and where it fits in, because this will make your journey easier for you, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. It's a really enjoyable science because it consists of both theory as well as practical mechanics of the science. And the more you learn about it, the more respect and the more confidence you have in our tradition, because you see the meticulous nature with which our scholars actually applied themselves just to preserve and to really celebrate the great sunnah of our beloved messenger, Nabi Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam. So to summarize, in this lesson, we've looked at the hadith classification from the perspective of acceptability and rejection. We've looked at hadith classification from the perspective of the reasons for rejection. And then specifically, we looked at the types of breaks in the chain. Until next time, inshaAllah ta'ala, jazakumullahu khairan for joining. Wa sallallahu ala sayyidina Muhammad, subhanallahi wa bihamdik, subhanakallahumma wa bihamdik, nashhadu an la ilaha illa anta, nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.